There are several aspects to be understood. When Archbishop Lefebvre decided to use the 1962 rite, he decided so because, to him, it was the last acceptable form of all the changes. And I will come back to that later. That's part of the problem of self-defense. There are rules for legitimate self-defense. Let me first point out the changes. Now, Pius XII started, and I do not want you to get hooked with the name of Bonini. To us, it is of no importance, of mere historical importance, if it was really the same Annibale Bonini who changed the Holy Week and who wrote up the new Mass. This is academic. It's an academic problem, because the responsibility is always with the Pope and not the Monsignor, Father, Archbishop, or whatever creep he chooses for that. The responsibility is not with Bonini, the responsibility is with the Pope. We are not concerned about historical questions here. It is sad to see that Pius XII was tricked into doing what he did by Bonini. But it's his fault, not mine. So, do not get stuck with the name of Bonini. Bonini is certainly one of the sorriest names in church history, but that's not the problem. The problem is that Pius XII gave his signature to something which I cannot consider legal. I repeat, I cannot consider legal. He did not only change a few little things in Holy Week, he made a radical change in Good Friday. Now let me explain just the day by day what he did. In the Mass of all times, on Palm Sunday, this is something going back to the old days when you had a bishop's cathedral and many filial churches, or an important parish church and an unimportant filial church in the same parish. On Palm Sunday, the priest would, dressed in violet, as should be for Passion, and not in red as now, the priest would bless the palm leaves. He would bless them in what is a relic of a Mass. So he would start out just like at Mass. He would start out with a reading, with the Kyrie, with a reading, with the Gospel, with a preface. And after the preface, instead of saying the canon and consecrating the host, he would bless the palm leaves with 5 prayers. And then a procession would form and proceed towards the main church. In the old days, the Episcopal Church, the cathedral of the bishop. Knock at the cathedral's door, or at the main church's door, and request entrance into heavenly Jerusalem. So that made sense. That is a representation of what happened on Palm Sunday with our Lord Jesus Christ. When they received him as a king to come, and they received him with palm leaves, and then they let him enter the city of Jerusalem. And then, of course, the first sacrifice of Mass took place in Jerusalem. So the Palm Sunday is nothing else but a visible representation of what happened on that very day with Christ. Pope Pius XII abolished most of the prayers of consecration for the palm leaves, and he abolished the preface. Now, abolishing the preface means he took away one of the few consecratory prefaces left in the Latin Church. In the old days, an important blessing was not just done with a few oremus, etc., and a few signs of the cross. An important benediction was done with a preface. I will come back to that on Easter Vigil. He did away with the consecratory preface. The consecratory preface of the palm leaves is going back to the early centuries. So he did away with with a millennial tradition. Saint Chrysostomus would have rejected that. So would Saint Pius V. And so do I, because they would have. But I say again, I'm not the Pope. I reject it. I cannot pronounce judgment over the priests who don't. I can only judge priests quoting popes and councils. If the present Pope wants to utter heresy, and I can prove to him that what he says is heresy, I can charge him with heresy. But I cannot do so just because he contradicts me or another theologian. No theologian may ever dare to put the Pope in his place as such. Only when you quote councils and popes, you can put the Pope in his place. On Holy Thursday, Pope Pius XII did not change much. On Good Friday, he did, in fact, destroy the only Mass of the pre-sanctified left in the Latin Church. A Missa Praesanctificatorum is a symbolic representation not of the sacrifice of Christ, but it is a symbolic representation of the Old Testament, of the just in the Old Testament. Praesanctificatorum, the Mass of those who are pre-sanctified. Pre-sanctified means the saints of the Old Testament, Moses, Elias, and so on. The Mass of the pre-sanctified does not have a consecration. It does not have communion for the people. It only has communion of the priest with a host that was consecrated the day before. In the Eastern Rite, they still have Masses of the pre-sanctified on the Ember days. In the Latin Church, we don't have a one left. None. What Pius XII did is he changed the Mass of the pre-sanctified into a liturgy of the Word, which is something we find now in the New Church, and the Church of the New Advent, as John Paul II dares to call his own church. What Pius XII did was, first of all, he abolished the Mass vestment for the priest. He made the priest take off the black chasuble. Now you have to remember that the very two vestments of the Mass are the maniple and the chasuble, nothing else. A priest must wear a stole for all the other sacraments. He must wear a stole for all blessings. But he must never wear a chasuble and a maniple outside Mass. On Good Friday, he did wear a chasuble and a maniple, even though he did not consecrate. This is why it is called Missa Praesanctificatorum, Mass of the Pre-Sanctified. And he was celebrating a Mass in black chasuble all through the rite, because he was celebrating the Requiem for Christ. That's exactly what Good Friday is. The Requiem for Christ. The Requiem for Christ. Because on Good Friday, he did not resurrect. On Good Friday, he died. And when somebody dies, you celebrate a Requiem for him. Most of all, our Lord. Pope Pius XII made the priest wear a black cope for the first part of the rite. And for the second part of the rite, he made him wear a violet chasuble. The argument for doing this was somewhat false. When I asked somebody who knew the discussions of the time, why did they change the black into the violet, he said, because you never have black connected with the Holy Eucharist. Which is true to the point that on a tabernacle, even in a Requiem Mass, the tabernacle curtain must never be black, it must be violet even in a Requiem Mass. Out of respect for the Blessed Sacrament, which is alive and not dead. However, why then, if they pretend to have changed the liturgical colors from black to violet for the communion rite, why then did they abolish the incense? So this is highly contradictory, it doesn't make sense. Apart from the question that changing the oldest rite in the Catholic Church is a crime. He also, as I just mentioned, did away with the incense. Now, the important thing about Good Friday is, even when our Lord died, he was still our Lord. He always is. He never ceased to be God. Even the dead Christ on the cross was still God, and always will be, and always is. There is no yesterday, today, and tomorrow with God. So on that very day, you have to have a very special reverence for the one consecrated host that will be very soon consumed by the priest, which is a symbolic representation of what happened on Good Friday, when God himself carried his own instrument of death, and when the people accompanied Christ to the cross, they accompanied God, not a man, God first, then a man, full God, full man. That is what Christ's incarnation means. They accompanied God. They had to genuflect in front of God. They had to revere God. And this is exactly what happens on Good Friday in the old days. 2 altar servers, 2 thurifers, with 2 incenses, walk backwards, face towards the Eucharist, and incense the Blessed Sacrament until it arrives at the altar. Then the priest prostrates down to earth. This was the old way to genuflect at consecration. And when the priest communicates Christ, at that very moment, the sacrifice of 2,000 years ago is completed. Every year, again. In a way that we would like to understand once we are in heaven, hopefully making it there, but we will never understand on earth because we do not understand the contradiction between time and eternity yet. When the priest communicates the host, and he alone, no Blessed Sacrament is supposed to be in the church, because when Christ died on the cross for 3 days, he was not there. Remember, he descended to hell, the hell of the paradise of the pre-sanctified just. He descended to hell with his soul, not, as John Paul II said on the 11th of January 1988, with his body, symbolically, because his body was in the grave. The Fourth Lateran Council defined as a dogma, Christ descended with his soul. And he consoled the just in the paradise that was prepared for them, to wait for the beatific vision in heaven. When Pius XII introduced the communion of the faithful on Good Friday, and when he made the priest change into the violet chasuble, and when he abolished the incense for the host, and when he decreed the cope to be used at the first part of Good Friday, he turned the first part into a liturgy of the Word, and the second part into a rite of communion for everybody. This is not the Mass of a pre-sanctified anymore. And that's probably the most grievous of all the changes. And it's probably the one that will indeed be refused by a future Pope. I hope so. On Holy Saturday, he destroyed the consecratory preface of the Easter candle. In the old days, the priest would light a candle from the fire that is blessed outside the church. He would light a candle, sing the Lumen Christi, dressed as a deacon if there's no deacon available. Then he would light the second candle, sing Lumen Christi again, light the third candle, sing Lumen Christi again, and thus, with the light of 3 candles only, he will arrive at the hopefully totally dark sanctuary, and there, the Easter candle is waiting for him. No incense in the Easter candle, no light. Then he starts the Exultet. Remember the Exultet iam angelica turba celorum. Exactly this. This is the consecratory preface for the Easter candle. At a certain point during this preface, the incense, the 5 grains of incense that have been blessed outside the church, will be mounted on the Easter candle in the sign of a cross. And a few paragraphs, one paragraph after that, finally, the Easter candle will be lit. This means the preface the deacon is singing is the consecratory preface of the Easter candle. Pius XII changed that round by having the priest bless, not consecrate, bless the Easter candle outside the church with a ridiculous new script on it, instead of the old consecration. So by the time the deacon arrives at the altar, the Easter candle has been blessed. The Easter candle has been decorated with incense. The Easter candle is ready. The Easter candle will be put up on the stand and light for what is now not anymore a consecratory preface, but a rather boring narration of some parts of the history of salvation. He has turned a consecratory preface into a gospel-like narration. That is changing the nature of Easter Vigil. In the old days, after that, the priest and lector and a few lectors available, if available, would sing 12 readings from the Old Testament. They would sing all the important parts of the history of salvation before Christ in the Old Testament. I perfectly well understand that some people are entirely bored with that, because the priest rattles down in Latin chant something that nobody understands anyway.